What did my teacher call extra credit that ended with handcuffs in the parking lot? I was 16 when Mr. Davison first mentioned the photography project that would eventually destroy his career and nearly ruin my life. He stood at the front of our junior English class explaining that students struggling with their grades could earn extra credit by participating in his documentary series about teenage identity in suburban America. I had a C- and my parents were threatening to pull me from the basketball team if I didn't bring it up to at least a B by semester's end. When Mr. Davison looked directly at me while describing the opportunity, I felt relieved that someone was offering me a way out of my academic hole. He was the kind of teacher everyone liked, mid-30s with an easy smile and a reputation for actually caring about students who struggled. He ran the school newspaper, coached forensics, and stayed late to help kids who needed it. Looking back, I realized that reputation was exactly what allowed him to operate undetected for so long. Trust is a weapon when placed in the wrong hands. After class, Mr. Davison asked me to stay back for a moment. "Kyle, I noticed you've been having trouble keeping up with the reading assignments. This project could really help your grade, and honestly, you'd be perfect for it." He explained that he was documenting the real lives of teenagers, moving beyond the stereotypes and surface-level portrayals in media. He wanted authentic stories, real struggles, actual teenage experiences. "I'm talking to several students about participating. It's completely voluntary, but participants will receive enough extra credit to bump their grade up a full letter, maybe more depending on their level of involvement." My pulse quickened at the possibility of salvaging my GPA without having to read another assigned novel I couldn't focus on. "What would I have to do?" I asked. Mr. Davison smiled warmly. "Just let me photograph you in your daily life. At home, with friends, doing normal teenage things. I want to capture authenticity, not posed shots. Think of it as photojournalism." I asked if my parents needed to sign anything, and Mr. Davison waved his hand dismissively. "This is an educational project within the scope of my teaching duties. I have permission from the school to run it. But if it makes you more comfortable, I can send home a permission slip." He pulled out a form from his desk that looked official enough, with the school letterhead and spaces for parent signatures. "Have them sign this if you decide to participate. First session would be this Saturday if you're interested." I took the form home that night and showed it to my mom while she was making dinner. She barely glanced at it before signing, asking only if this would help my grade. When I confirmed it would, she scribbled her signature and went back to chopping vegetables. My father signed it later without even reading it, trusting that if the school was involved, it must be legitimate. That trust would haunt them for years afterward. The first photography session happened at a coffee shop downtown on Saturday morning. Mr. Davison showed up with professional camera equipment, multiple lenses, and a friendly demeanor that put me at ease. "Just act natural," he instructed. "Order your coffee, sit and read, check your phone. I want candid shots that show real teenage life." I felt awkward at first, hyper-aware of the camera pointing at me, but Mr. Davison kept up a steady stream of conversation that distracted me from feeling self-conscious. He asked about my family, my interests, my struggles at school. I found myself opening up about my parents' divorce 2 years earlier, how my dad had moved 3 hours away and I barely saw him anymore, how my mom worked double shifts as a nurse and was always exhausted. "That's good," Mr. Davison said, snapping photos rapidly. "That emotion, that vulnerability. This is what makes the project powerful." After an hour, he packed up his equipment and thanked me for participating. "Next session, I'd like to photograph you at home if possible. Just your normal evening routine." The home session started innocently enough. Mr. Davison arrived on a Tuesday evening when my mom was working a night shift at the hospital. He photographed me doing homework at the kitchen table, watching television in the living room, making myself dinner from leftovers. "This is perfect," he kept saying. "Real life, unfiltered." But then he asked if he could photograph my bedroom, explaining that teenage bedrooms were particularly revealing spaces that showed personality and interests. I led him upstairs, suddenly conscious of how messy my room was, clothes on the floor, an unmade bed. Mr. Davison photographed everything, clicking away while making comments about composition and lighting. "Could you sit on the bed and look at your phone? I want to capture that typical teenage scene." I complied, feeling slightly uncomfortable but telling myself this was for a grade. "Great. Now could you take off your shirt? I want to show the casual way teenagers dress when they're alone at home." That request made my stomach tighten with unease. "I don't know if that's appropriate," I said, my voice uncertain. Mr. Davison lowered his camera and gave me a reassuring smile. "Kyle, this is art and documentation. There's nothing inappropriate about showing how teenagers actually live. You're wearing an undershirt beneath that, right? It's no different than being photographed at the pool." He had a point. I was wearing a white undershirt beneath my button-up. Reluctantly, I removed the outer shirt, feeling exposed, despite still being covered. Mr. Davison took several photos, then asked me to lie back on the bed in a more relaxed position. "Pretend you're about to fall asleep. Natural, comfortable." I lay back, staring at the ceiling while the camera shutter clicked repeatedly above me. "Perfect. You're a natural at this." He took a few more shots, then announced we were done for the evening. As he packed up his equipment, He mentioned that my grade had already improved to a B-, and with a few more sessions, I could easily reach an A. That academic validation made the discomfort seem worth it. The sessions continued over the next month, always when my mom was working and couldn't be there to supervise. Mr. Davison's requests gradually escalated in ways that felt wrong, but were framed so carefully that I questioned my own instincts. Could you change into athletic shorts? I want to document your basketball routine. Then, could you take a shower with the door slightly open? I want to capture the steam and the authentic teenage morning routine, just shadows and silhouettes, very artistic. Each request pushed boundaries incrementally, never quite crossing into anything I could definitively call inappropriate, but making me increasingly uncomfortable. I told myself that artists saw things differently, that Mr. Davison was a professional who knew what he was doing, that my discomfort was just my own prudishness. He praised me constantly, telling me I was his best subject, that I had a natural quality that made the photographs powerful and meaningful. That validation felt good, especially coming from a teacher I respected. Then came the session that changed everything. Mr. Davison arrived on a Friday evening with different equipment than usual, including lighting stands and reflectors. Tonight we're doing something more formal, he explained. Portrait work that really captures emotional vulnerability. I want you to think about the hardest things in your life, the pain you carry. Let that show on your face. He set up the lights in my bedroom, positioning them to create dramatic shadows. I need you to remove your shirt for this. I want to photograph strength and vulnerability simultaneously, the physical and emotional exposure teenagers experience. This time I hesitated more strongly. Mr. Davison, I really don't think this is appropriate anymore. These photos are getting weird. His expression shifted, becoming less warm and more calculating. Kyle, you do realize you've already participated in dozens of sessions. Your grade is dependent on completing this project. If you back out now, not only will you lose all the extra credit, but I'll have to report that you wasted school resources and my personal time. The threat in his words was clear even though his tone remained friendly. I felt trapped between my discomfort and my need for the grade. Besides, he continued, there's nothing inappropriate happening here. These are artistic portraits for an educational documentary. Your parents signed the permission form. Everything is completely above board. He pulled out a folder from his camera bag and showed me copies of the permission slip with my parents' signatures. If you're concerned, we can call your mother right now and confirm she approved this. The idea of my exhausted mother being dragged into this made me feel worse. I didn't want to burden her or create problems when she was already stretched so thin. Reluctantly, I removed my shirt, telling myself this was the last session I'd do. Mr. Davison's smile returned. Good. I knew you were mature enough to understand the artistic vision here. He photographed me for another hour, his directions becoming increasingly uncomfortable, asking me to convey emotions, to touch my own face and chest in ways that felt more intimate than artistic. When he finally left that night, I sat on my bed feeling sick and confused. Something was deeply wrong with what was happening, but I couldn't quite articulate what or why. I hadn't been touched inappropriately. Nothing explicitly sexual had occurred, yet I felt violated in a way I couldn't explain. I decided I wouldn't do any more sessions, grade consequences be damned. But Mr. Davison was clever about maintaining control. On Monday morning, he pulled me aside before class and handed me a progress report showing my grade had improved to an A-. Just a few more sessions and you'll have a solid A. Your mother must be so proud. He paused, then added casually, I showed some of the photographs to a colleague who's an art professor at the university. She was really impressed and asked if I had more work from this series. I told her I'd have a complete portfolio soon. The implication was clear. The photographs would be seen by others, would be compiled into something more permanent. I felt my face flush with humiliation and anger. You can't show those photos to people, I said, my voice low and urgent. I didn't agree to that. Mr. Davison's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes were cold. Kyle, you signed a model release form at our first session. Don't you remember? All participants agreed their images could be used for educational and artistic purposes. I didn't remember signing anything besides the parent permission slip, but Mr. Davison pulled out another form with my signature on it. Seeing my own handwriting there made me doubt my memory. Had I signed this without reading it properly? This is all completely legal and ethical, Mr. Davison assured me. But I understand if you're having second thoughts. We can stop the sessions anytime. Of course, that would mean incomplete participation, and I'd have to adjust your grade accordingly. Probably back down to where you started. Maybe lower since you've been neglecting regular assignments while focusing on this project. The trap closed around me completely. I was failing regular schoolwork because I'd relied on extra credit to carry my grade. If that disappeared, I'd be worse off than when I started. I went through 2 more sessions in a state of numb compliance, disconnecting mentally from what was happening, while Mr. Davison photographed me in increasingly compromising positions and states of undress. He never touched me directly, never did anything I could point to as definitively criminal, but the psychological manipulation was suffocating. He had crafted a situation where I felt I had no choice but to continue, where backing out would result in academic failure and exposure of photographs I was now deeply ashamed of. The worst part was that I blamed myself for getting into this situation, for not recognizing the warning signs earlier, for being stupid enough to think this was legitimate. That self-blame kept me silent when I should have been screaming for help. Predators understand that shame is their best weapon, that victims will often protect their abusers rather than face the humiliation of admitting what happened. Everything fell apart because of another student named Jeremy Cho. Jeremy was in my grade, but we weren't particularly close, just nodded to each other in hallways occasionally. One afternoon in late November, I was leaving the school library when I saw Jeremy coming out of Mr. Davison's classroom looking visibly upset. His eyes were red and his hands were shaking. We made eye contact for just a moment, and I saw something in his expression that mirrored what I felt every time I left one of those photography sessions. Violated, confused, and deeply ashamed. "You doing the extra credit project too?" I asked quietly. Jeremy's face went pale, and he nodded barely perceptibly. "The photography thing?" Another nod. We stood there in the empty hallway, two teenage boys who suddenly understood they weren't alone in something terrible. "It's not right, is it?" Jeremy whispered. "What he's doing, the way he takes pictures, the things he says." Hearing someone else voice what I'd been feeling, but couldn't articulate, broke something open inside me. "No," I said firmly. "It's not right. It's really not right." Jeremy looked around nervously to make sure we were alone, then spoke rapidly. "He's been photographing me for 6 weeks. At first it was normal stuff, but then it got weird. He wants me to pose in my underwear now. Says it's about vulnerability and authenticity. My parents think I'm at study group." The details were horrifyingly familiar. "He's doing the same thing to me," I admitted. "Started normal, kept pushing boundaries. Now I feel trapped because my grade depends on it." Jeremy's expression shifted from shame to anger. "There have to be other students. He's been running this extra credit project for 2 years according to the school newspaper archives. We can't be the only ones." That realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. How many other students had Mr. Davison manipulated? How many had gone through these sessions believing they were alone, too ashamed to speak up? Jeremy pulled out his phone. "I've been keeping the text messages he sends, instructions for sessions, times to meet, comments about the photos. I didn't know what to do with them, but I couldn't delete them either." I felt a surge of clarity cut through months of confusion. "We need to tell someone. This has to stop." Jeremy looked terrified. "Who would believe us? He's a respected teacher. He has permission slips signed by our parents. He'll say we're making it up or misunderstanding artistic intent." Those were the exact fears that had kept me silent, but hearing them out loud made me realize how much power we were giving Mr. Davison by staying quiet. "My phone has timestamps for when he's been at my house," I said, thinking rapidly. "My mom works nights. If he's been coming over when there's no parental supervision, that's already suspicious. And if there are text messages, if there are multiple students saying the same thing, it's not just our word against his." We exchanged phone numbers right there in the hallway and agreed to document everything we could remember. Times, dates, specific requests, inappropriate comments, all of it. Then we needed to find other students and see if they'd been targeted too. The thought of more victims made me feel sick, but it also fueled my determination to expose what was happening. Finding other victims was easier and more horrifying than expected. Jeremy remembered seeing a sophomore named Colin Park coming out of Mr. Davison's classroom after school one day looking uncomfortable. We approached Colin carefully during lunch the next day, asking if he was involved in any extra credit projects. Colin's face immediately showed recognition and fear. "The photography thing?" "Yeah. It was supposed to help my grade in English, but it got really uncomfortable. I stopped going after the 3rd session." We asked what made him stop, and Colin described requests that were identical to what Jeremy and I had experienced. Progressive undressing, intimate poses, psychological pressure to continue. He said I was wasting his time and resources by quitting early. Threatened to report me for academic dishonesty, said I'd signed contracts I didn't remember signing, but I just stopped answering his texts and avoided him. Colin had been luckier than us, managing to extract himself before getting as deeply trapped. "Are there others?" I asked. Colin nodded grimly. "I think he targeted at least 5 or 6 students last year alone, mostly guys who were struggling academically and didn't have involved parents, kids who were vulnerable." We spent the next week identifying and carefully approaching other potential victims. The pattern was devastatingly consistent. Academically struggling students, usually with single parents or families dealing with financial stress, always boys between 15 and 17. Mr. Davison had refined his predatory technique over multiple years, perfecting the approach that would hook vulnerable teenagers and trap them in situations they felt powerless to escape. By the end of our investigation, we had identified 8 students total who'd been through various stages of the photography project. Some had extracted themselves early, like Colin. Others, like Jeremy and me, had endured months of escalating exploitation. One senior named Trevor admitted he'd participated throughout his entire junior year, and the psychological damage was evident in how he could barely make eye contact while describing what had happened. "He still has all those photos," Trevor said, his voice hollow. "Sometimes I see him in the hallway and he smiles at me, and I know he's thinking about those images. It makes me want to disappear." The weight of what we'd uncovered was crushing. This wasn't a misguided art project or a teacher who'd accidentally crossed boundaries. This was calculated, systematic abuse of power and trust, carried out over years while the school administration remained completely oblivious. We needed to report it, but we needed to be strategic. If we went to the school first, there was a real possibility they'd protect their reputation over protecting us. Jeremy suggested we go directly to the police, but I worried we wouldn't be taken seriously without some kind of official school involvement. Then Colin mentioned something that changed our approach entirely. My older sister is a reporter for the city newspaper. She covers education and social issues. If we went to her first, if we got the story documented by someone who'd believe us and investigate properly, then went to authorities with media backing, they'd have to take it seriously. It felt risky to involve media before going through official channels, but we'd all seen enough news stories about institutional cover-ups to know that sunlight was often the only disinfectant that actually worked. Colin's sister Laura was 26 and took us seriously from the first moment we contacted her. We met at a coffee shop far from school, all 8 victims present with our parents, and spent 3 hours detailing everything that had happened. Laura recorded the conversation with everyone's permission, took notes, and asked careful questions that helped us articulate things we'd struggled to put into words. She was visibly shaken by what we described but remained professional, explaining that what we'd experienced was absolutely abuse, that grooming didn't require physical contact to be harmful, that photographic exploitation of minors was a serious crime, even if the images themselves weren't technically pornographic. He created situations of psychological coercion and used his position of authority to extract intimate images from vulnerable students. That's abuse, full stop. Hearing an adult name, it clearly gave us validation we desperately needed. Laura said she'd investigate further, would try to determine if there were more victims we hadn't identified, and would coordinate with us before publishing anything to ensure our safety and privacy. The investigation Laura conducted over the next 2 weeks was thorough and devastating. She discovered that Mr. Davison had worked at 2 previous schools before coming to ours, leaving both under circumstances that weren't publicly disclosed, but involved complaints about inappropriate conduct with students. The schools had quietly let him resign rather than face the scandal of firing him for cause, effectively passing a predator along to harm children elsewhere. She also found that several parents at our school had complained about the photography project over the years, expressing discomfort with their children being photographed in private settings, but the administration had dismissed these concerns because Mr. Davison was well-liked and the project had official approval. The permission slips provided legal cover that the school hid behind rather than investigating whether something inappropriate was occurring. Laura built a case that was impossible to dismiss or ignore, documenting institutional failure alongside individual predation. When she finally showed us her draft article, it was devastating and comprehensive, naming Mr. Davison explicitly and detailing the pattern of abuse while protecting our identities as minors. Before publication, Laura contacted the school district's superintendent and the police department, informing them that she had extensive documentation of abuse by a teacher at Kennedy High School and would be publishing in 48 hours. That notification triggered immediate action. 2 detectives showed up at school the next morning and pulled Mr. Davison out of his second period class for questioning. By lunchtime, word had spread through the entire student body that something serious was happening. Mr. Davison was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and all 8 of us who'd been identified as victims were called to meet with detectives and school counselors. My mother was called away from her shift at the hospital and arrived looking terrified, demanding to know what was happening. When the detective explained that her son had been systematically exploited by a teacher she'd trusted with my education, she collapsed into a chair and started crying. "I signed that permission slip. I let this happen. I didn't protect you." The guilt in her voice was terrible to hear because I knew exactly how she felt. We'd both been manipulated by someone who was expert at appearing trustworthy. The detective who interviewed me was a woman named Sergeant Delacroix, who specialized in crimes against children. She was professional but kind, explaining that I wasn't in trouble, that everything I'd experienced was abuse regardless of how it had been framed, and that my cooperation would help ensure Mr. Davison faced consequences. I told her everything, showing her the text messages, the timeline I'd documented, the descriptions of progressive exploitation. She took notes carefully, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions, and when I finished, she said something that I needed to hear. "You did nothing wrong. An adult in a position of authority manipulated you systematically. The shame you feel belongs to him, not to you. What you're doing right now by coming forward is incredibly brave and will protect other students from experiencing what you went through." She explained that they'd be executing a search warrant on Mr. Davison's home and school computer, looking for evidence of the photographs and any other concerning materials. "If what you've described is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt you, he'll be facing serious criminal charges." The search of Mr. Davison's home revealed horrors beyond what we'd known. Detectives found over 10,000 photographs stored on external hard drives, organized into folders by student name and date. The images went back 6 years, documenting dozens of students we'd never identified. Some photographs were from school settings, seemingly innocent shots of students in classrooms and hallways, but many were from private sessions, identical to what we'd experienced, showing teenage boys in various states of undress and vulnerable positions. While none of the images were explicitly pornographic, the collection as a whole constituted a catalog of exploitation. documenting Mr. Davison's systematic abuse of his position over years. Even more disturbing, detectives found journals where he'd written detailed notes about each student's vulnerabilities, family situations, and psychological weak points. He'd been studying us like specimens, identifying exactly which pressure points to exploit. One entry about me read, "Kyle responds well to academic pressure. Mother works nights, father absent. Craves male approval and validation. Excellent subject, very compliant." Reading those words made me feel sick. I'd thought the sessions were about art and education, that my participation meant something beyond just exploitation. But to Mr. Davison, I'd been nothing more than a vulnerable target, someone whose weakness he could identify and leverage. The detectives found similar clinical assessments of every student he'd targeted, showing that none of this had been accidental or impulsive. This was calculated predation, carried out with full awareness of the harm being caused. The evidence was so overwhelming that Mr. Davison's attorney immediately began negotiating a plea deal, knowing that taking this to trial would result in a much harsher sentence. But the victims, all of us who'd been photographed and manipulated, wanted him to face trial. We wanted to testify, to make him hear what he'd done to us, to ensure he couldn't hide behind legal maneuvering. The prosecutor, a man named David Sung, met with all the victims and our families to explain what trial would involve and to ask if we were prepared for the difficulty of testifying. "Testifying will be hard," Mr. Sung explained. "The defense will try to suggest you're exaggerating or misremembering, that the project was legitimate and you're retroactively reframing it because of public pressure. They'll point to the permission slips your parents signed and the model releases. They'll try to make it seem consensual and appropriate, even though we know it absolutely wasn't." He paused, looking at each of us seriously. "But if you're willing to testify, if you're willing to face that cross-examination, the impact will be powerful. Juries respond to victim testimony, especially when there's a pattern across multiple witnesses. You'll be believed." We all agreed without hesitation. We'd already come this far, already exposed the truth. Backing down now would mean letting Mr. Davison control the narrative one final time. The trial was scheduled for 4 months later, giving us time to prepare, but not so much time that evidence could be challenged or memories could be questioned. In the meantime, Laura's article published and became a national story overnight. The combination of teacher abuse, institutional failure, and multiple victims created a perfect storm of outrage and attention. The article's publication changed everything at school. Students who'd previously liked Mr. Davison were shocked and confused, unable to reconcile the friendly teacher they'd known with the predator he actually was. Some defended him initially, arguing that we must be exaggerating or misunderstanding, but as more details emerged and more victims came forward, even his most loyal supporters had to accept the truth. The school administration faced intense criticism for missing warning signs and for accepting teacher conduct at face value without proper oversight. The principal gave a press conference where he apologized and announced policy changes. No more private meetings between teachers and students without open doors, mandatory reporting training for all staff, independent review of any programs involving student photography or private contact. These changes felt insufficient given how badly the system had failed, but they were acknowledgement that failure had occurred. My mother struggled intensely with guilt over signing that permission slip, over not being more present because of her work schedule, over trusting a teacher who'd seemed so legitimate. I had to repeatedly assure her that the fault belonged entirely to Mr. Davison, that his manipulation was expert enough to fool anyone. The months leading up to trial were therapeutic hell. All the victims were in counseling, processing trauma we'd barely begun to understand. My therapist, Dr. Nina Patel, specialized in childhood sexual abuse and exploitation. She explained that what we'd experienced was grooming, that the progressive boundary violation was textbook predatory behavior, and that the psychological impact could be long-lasting even without physical contact. "Your brain registers this as violation because it was violation," she explained. "Your instincts were telling you something was wrong, but you were manipulated into doubting those instincts. Learning to trust yourself again will take time." She taught me strategies for managing intrusive thoughts, for separating shame that belonged to me from shame that belonged to my abuser, for understanding that victimization didn't define my identity. The other victims and I formed a support group, meeting weekly to share our experiences and prepare for trial together. That solidarity was crucial because we each struggled with moments of doubt where we wondered if we were overreacting or if testifying would make things worse. Having others who understood exactly what we'd been through made those doubts manageable. The trial began on a cold morning in March. The courthouse was imposing and formal, designed to intimidate, and I felt my heart racing as we walked through security and into the courtroom. Mr. Davison sat at the defense table looking smaller than I remembered, wearing a suit and glasses that made him appear professional and harmless. His attorney was a woman named Ms. Reeves, who had a reputation for aggressive defense tactics. During opening statements, she argued that Mr. Davison had been running a legitimate educational documentary project approved by the school, that all participants had signed releases and their parents had given permission, and that the current prosecution was a tragic misunderstanding fueled by media hysteria. These were art photographs taken with full knowledge and consent. The fact that some students now regret their participation doesn't make it criminal. The prosecutor's opening statement was more powerful, describing systematic grooming and exploitation, showing the jury examples of Mr. Davison's journal entries where he analyzed students' vulnerabilities, and explaining that consent obtained through manipulation and coercion wasn't real consent at all. I testified on the second day of trial. Walking to the witness stand felt surreal, like watching myself from outside my body. After being sworn in, Mr. Sung began with easy questions: my name, age, grade level, how I knew Mr. Davison. Then we moved into more difficult territory. Can you describe how you became involved in the photography project? I explained the academic pressure, the offer of extra credit, the permission slip my mother signed without suspicion. How did the photography sessions progress over time? I detailed the escalation, from coffee shop to home sessions to increasingly intimate and uncomfortable requests. Did you want to participate in these later sessions? I shook my head. No, but I felt trapped. My grade depended on it, and Mr. Davison made it clear that backing out would have serious consequences. Ms. Reeves's cross-examination tried to poke holes in my account, suggesting I'd understood the artistic nature of the project, and only regretted it after media attention made it seem scandalous. Isn't it true you voluntarily removed your clothing for photographs? She asked. I removed clothing because Mr. Davison, an adult authority figure I trusted, told me it was necessary for the project and that refusing would harm my grade. But you could have refused. You could have told your mother. You could have reported concerns to school administration. Ms. Reeves's tone suggested I bore responsibility for not protecting myself better. I felt anger rise up, cutting through my nervousness. I was 16 years old dealing with an adult who had power over my academic future and who was expert at making wrong things seem normal. Yes, I could have done those things in theory, but he'd spent months breaking down my ability to trust my own instincts and making me believe I'd signed contracts I couldn't back out of. That's called grooming. The prosecutor had prepared me for this line of questioning, but actually facing it was still difficult. Ms. Reeves tried several more angles, attempting to portray me as a willing participant who'd made mature choices and now regretted them. But I held firm to the truth. I'd been manipulated by an adult who knew exactly what he was doing. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I felt exhausted, but relieved. I'd told the truth under oath, and the jury had listened attentively throughout. The other victims testified over the next several days, each describing experiences that were horrifyingly consistent with mine. Jeremy talked about the text messages pressuring him to participate. Colin described how he'd felt sick after each session, but didn't understand why until much later. Trevor, the senior who'd endured the abuse longest, broke down crying on the stand while describing how the experience had destroyed his sense of self-worth and safety. I thought I was going crazy because nothing explicitly wrong was happening, but I felt violated anyway. Now I know that's exactly how grooming works. It makes you doubt your own reality. The defense couldn't effectively challenge these accounts because the pattern was too consistent and the physical evidence too overwhelming. Dr. Patel testified as an expert witness about grooming behaviors and psychological manipulation, explaining to the jury how predators establish trust before progressively violating boundaries. The fact that no explicit sexual contact occurred doesn't make this less harmful. Psychological abuse leaves scars that last just as long as physical abuse. A digital forensics expert testified about the 10,000 photographs found on Mr. Davison's hard drives, explaining that the organization and notation showed clear consciousness of wrongdoing. The most damaging testimony came from a former student named Alex, who'd graduated 3 years earlier and who'd come forward after Laura's article published. Alex had been one of Mr. Davison's first victims at our school, participating in the photography project when he was 15. I've lived with shame and confusion for years, not understanding what had happened to me or why I felt so violated by something that seemed artistic and educational. Alex described sessions that had progressed even further than what the current victims experienced, including requests to pose nude under the justification of classical artistic study. He showed me books of Renaissance paintings with nude subjects and said what we were doing was the same thing. I believed him because he was my teacher, and I thought teachers wouldn't lie about something that important. Alex had only realized years later, after therapy for unrelated anxiety issues, that what he'd experienced was sexual exploitation. My therapist asked detailed questions about where my anxiety originated, and when I described the photography sessions, she immediately identified it as abuse. That was the first time anyone had named it clearly for me. Hearing Alex's testimony showed the jury the long-term trajectory of Mr. Davison's predation and the lasting harm it caused. The defense called character witnesses, who testified about Mr. Davison's dedication as an educator, his involvement in school activities, his reputation for helping struggling students. Several current students testified that they'd never experienced anything inappropriate from him and found him supportive and professional. But the prosecution effectively countered by pointing out that predators don't abuse everyone they encounter. They carefully select vulnerable targets who are unlikely to be believed. The fact that Mr. Davison was kind to some students doesn't erase the systematic abuse of others. That's how predators operate. They build reputations as wonderful people so that victims who come forward are dismissed as liars or troublemakers. Mr. Davison himself chose not to testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right, which meant the jury never heard him explain his actions in his own words. His attorney argued this was standard legal strategy and shouldn't be held against him, but the refusal to testify felt like an admission that he had no good explanation for what he'd done. In closing arguments, the prosecutor laid out the evidence methodically: the pattern of targeting vulnerable students, the progressive boundary violations, the journal entries showing calculated manipulation, the massive collection of photographs, the consistent testimony from multiple victims describing identical experiences. This wasn't art. This wasn't education. This was a respected teacher exploiting his position of trust to sexually abuse children over multiple years. The evidence is overwhelming, and the pattern is undeniable. Ms. Reeves's closing argument tried to reframe everything as a misguided but well-intentioned project that had been retroactively criminalized by changing social standards. Photography of teenagers isn't inherently abuse. Documentary projects aren't automatically exploitation. The prosecution wants you to convict a dedicated teacher for using methods that made some students uncomfortable in retrospect. That's not how criminal law works. But the prosecutor's rebuttal demolished that defense. Grooming children for sexual purposes is criminal, regardless of whether the predator calls it art. Coercing minors into intimate photography through psychological manipulation is abuse, regardless of whether permission slips were signed. This man spent years perfecting his predatory techniques, and the only reason we're in this courtroom is because brave teenagers found the courage to expose him. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before reaching a verdict. We waited in a conference room at the courthouse, all the victims and our families together, anxiety filling every moment of silence. When we were finally called back into the courtroom, I felt like I might throw up. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of sexual exploitation of a minor. Guilty of child endangerment. Guilty of abuse of authority. The relief that flooded through me was so intense, I started shaking. My mother grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Davison showed no emotion, just stared straight ahead as the judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months. The system had worked. The truth had been heard and believed. Justice was actually going to happen. Outside, reporters crowded around asking for statements, but our attorney had prepared us for this. We issued a brief collective statement thanking the jury, the prosecutor, and Laura for her investigative work, and expressing hope that this case would encourage other victims of educator abuse to come forward. Then we went home to finally begin processing everything that had happened. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later was where we finally got to address Mr. Davison directly. The judge allowed victim impact statements, and each of us who wanted to speak was given time to explain how his actions had affected our lives. Jeremy went first, describing panic attacks and trust issues that made normal relationships difficult. You took away my ability to feel safe with authority figures. Every teacher I interact with now, I wonder if they're like you, if they're looking at me the way you did. Colin talked about the shame he'd carried for years, believing he'd done something wrong by participating. Trevor described dropping out of extracurricular activities and isolating himself because being around adults made him anxious. When my turn came, I looked directly at Mr. Davison for the first time since trial began. You told me the photography project would help my grade and my future. Instead, you taught me that adults with power can't be trusted, that institutions will fail to protect vulnerable people, and that predators hide behind reputations and official approval. You didn't just take inappropriate photographs. You damaged my ability to trust my own instincts and judgment. Mr. Davison was given an opportunity to speak before sentencing. He stood and addressed the court, but his statement was full of justifications and deflections rather than genuine accountability. I never intended to harm anyone. My goal was always educational, to document authentic teenage experiences for a project that would benefit understanding of adolescent development. I deeply regret that some students misinterpreted my artistic intentions and felt uncomfortable. That was never my goal. Even in this moment, he couldn't admit what he'd actually done, couldn't name his actions as abuse. The judge's expression hardened as he listened. When Mr. Davison finished, the judge delivered a scathing response. Mr. Davison, you had multiple opportunities throughout this process to take genuine responsibility for your actions. Instead, you've hidden behind claims of artistic intent and educational purpose while showing no real remorse for the harm you caused. The evidence showed calculated grooming and exploitation of vulnerable children under your care. The journal entries alone prove you knew exactly what you were doing and deliberately targeted students you identified as easy to manipulate. The judge sentenced Mr. Davison to 15 years in prison, the maximum possible under the charges. You abused your position of trust in the most egregious way possible, exploiting children who looked to you for guidance and support. You will serve this sentence in full, and upon release, you will be registered as a sex offender for life and permanently barred from any work involving contact with minors. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. 15 years. Mr. Davison would be in his 50s when released. His teaching career destroyed, his reputation permanently ruined. As he was led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that he'd face serious consequences. Satisfaction that justice had been served, but also residual trauma that wouldn't be erased by a verdict. The sentence didn't undo what had happened. It didn't remove the photographs from my memory or eliminate the work I'd still need to do in therapy. But it did validate that what we'd experienced was real and serious, that we'd been right to come forward, and that the system could sometimes protect victims instead of institutions. Outside the courthouse, we faced another crowd of reporters. This time, Jeremy and I had prepared a longer statement that we read together. This verdict represents accountability not just for one predator, but for a system that failed to protect students. Mr. Davison worked at 3 schools, and at each one, warning signs were ignored or dismissed. Our hope is that this case leads to real change in how schools handle complaints about teacher conduct, how they vet educators before hiring them, and how they prioritize student safety over institutional reputation. We also hope this encourages other survivors of educator abuse to come forward. You will be believed. The shame belongs to abusers, not to victims. The statement felt powerful to deliver, transforming our victimization into advocacy. Several news outlets did follow-up stories about systemic failures in educator oversight, and within months, state legislation was proposed requiring more thorough background checks and mandatory reporting of educator misconduct between schools. Our case became a catalyst for change larger than just one predator being convicted. The months after sentencing were about rebuilding. I continued therapy, working through layers of trauma that revealed themselves gradually. Dr. Patel helped me understand that healing wasn't linear, that I might have periods of feeling fine, followed by unexpected triggers or emotional flashbacks. Recovery from abuse is a process, not a destination. You'll have good days and hard days, and both are part of healing. My relationship with my mother deepened as we worked through what had happened together. She joined a support group for parents of abuse survivors and was learning how to support me without drowning in her own guilt. My grades improved genuinely this time, not through manipulation or shortcuts, but through actual work and support from teachers who understood what I'd been through. I rejoined the basketball team and found that physical activity helped manage anxiety in ways that talking sometimes didn't. The structure and teamwork gave me back a sense of normalcy and control. Jeremy, Colin, Trevor, and I stayed close, bonded by shared experience, but determined not to let it define our entire friendship. We hung out like normal teenagers, playing video games and complaining about homework, but we also checked in on each other when things got hard. 2 years later, I was invited to speak at a national conference on educator ethics and student safety. Standing in front of hundreds of teachers and administrators, I told our story and challenged them to do better. You have incredible power over the students in your care. That power can be used to nurture and educate, or it can be weaponized to exploit and harm. The difference is in your choices and in the systems you create to protect vulnerable kids. Every school thinks they could never have a teacher like Mr. Davison. Every institution believes they'd catch warning signs before real harm occurs. But predators are skilled at appearing trustworthy. They're often the most beloved teachers, the ones everyone defends when accusations emerge. Your job is to create systems where reports are investigated thoroughly regardless of a teacher's reputation, where student safety matters more than avoiding scandal, and where potential victims know they'll be believed if they come forward. The speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it led to consulting opportunities where I could help schools develop better protective policies. Turning trauma into purpose didn't erase what had happened, but it gave meaning to the suffering. Now, at 19, I'm in college studying social work with a focus on child advocacy. The photography project that nearly destroyed my adolescence ultimately shaped my entire career trajectory. I understand systems that fail vulnerable people because I've lived through that failure. I understand the psychology of predators because I've been systematically groomed by one. I understand the courage it takes to come forward because I've faced cross-examination and public exposure. That knowledge makes me effective in ways that textbook learning never could. Mr. Davison is serving his sentence in a state prison 3 hours away. I've never visited and never will. He's written letters attempting to make amends, but they remain unopened. Some people believe forgiveness is necessary for healing, but I've learned that's not true for me. I can acknowledge that he's a human being without forgiving the calculated harm he caused. I can move forward with my life without granting him absolution he hasn't earned. The handcuffs in the parking lot that day marked the end of his freedom and the beginning of ours. Justice arrived late, but it arrived, and that has to be enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments. Now and let me know your take in the comments. Now and let me know your take in the comments. Now and let me know your take in the comments. Now and let me know your take